Okay, hello there everyone. My name is Zoe and welcome. Just a little bit of information about me, just to provide some context. I am originally from Melbourne, Australia, and I'm a registered mental health social worker. I relocated to Thailand about 4 years ago where I was working as a trauma therapist. And I'm currently joining you today from Cambodia, which has been home for the last year whilst undertaking my research in the area of trauma and resilience. So I am due to submit my doctoral studies in a few short months in this area. And if you are listening to this recording from Mauritius, you might be thinking at this point, why is an Australian therapist based in Cambodia coming up in my Facebook newsfeed? And the reason for that, good question, is that Mauritius is my soon-to-be home. So I was in the process of applying for a residency and a work permit for Mauritius, and obviously COVID hit, so who knows when that will happen. And the reason that a lot of my videos and webinars and things like this will be going live to Mauritius is because, well, you could be my future neighbours. And that's the purpose why. So this is not a session to find clients or anything like that at this point. It's quite simply for me to bring myself into Mauritius in an online capacity and also hopefully connect with many of you prior to my relocation. Anyway, that's about me. Let's talk about this session and the context for this session. It is, of course, in relation to COVID-19. So when we look at change as a whole, and for you now, reflecting back on your life, change in your relationships, change in the workplace, change perhaps in your locations, all of these changes that we go through is very much around a process. It's very, very rarely one event. We shift, we are now in our new position. And what that means is that people experience quite a range of reactions throughout that process. And you will have noticed within your families, your colleagues, and people that you know, this wide range of emotions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what I wanted to do right now is just normalize what's going on in terms of those emotional responses. Many of us have felt very stressed, anxious, worried, concerned. And the thing about COVID is that it's not just about potentially contracting the virus, or perhaps one of your family members is in a high risk category. It is permeating all areas of our life. So lockdown, children at school, the way that we work is very different. We may have lost our jobs as a result. There are all of these factors that are affecting our personal life, our work life, and our country's life. And therefore the change doesn't stay in one area, because psychologists will say when we are experiencing change in one area of our life, it is best to maintain calm and stability in the other areas. Now, it's nice in theory, right? But with something like COVID, it's impacting all areas, which is making it even more stressful. So at the moment, we are in a transitional period, and humans, for the most part, immensely dislike this. It doesn't go with our nature. You know, when we know this is how it's going to impact us, and then we can start putting in action plans. A lot of what's occurring at the moment is making us feel like we're treading water, metaphorically speaking. We don't know what the long-term ramifications are. We don't understand the complete impact because we're not there yet. So those new beginnings in some countries are starting to develop. People are returning to work in a limited capacity. Some schools are opening. I know Mauritius, you're looking at another month of lockdown. So what does that look like to you? What emotions are you experiencing on a daily basis? Often we might experience a whole range of different emotions, and it can be seen as an opportunity for development. And in this session, I'm going to be talking specifically around what strategies will help us during, well, this very uncomfortable time of uncertainty and treading water, what we can do to take back some of that control when we feel like we have no control. Well, we don't have any control over COVID. So it's around asking yourself that question, what can I do for myself in the here and now today to help move through these challenging times? So let's look at adapting to this new world. As I mentioned, that change is cutting across all areas of life, and that is creating fear of the unknown. In my career running online wellbeing sessions, I, pre-COVID, have also done a lot of adapting to change sessions. And when I ask the question to people, what is it that makes people so uncomfortable about change? I always hear the same thing: fear of the unknown and uncertainty, because it is a very uncomfortable position for many of us to be stuck in. And it's these different ways of living. I was reading a really interesting article by a therapist recently, and she raised an interesting point because she was working from home prior to COVID. And so her work life had not changed as dramatically as what a lot of other people's had. And I'm the same. So I identified with that. But she also talked about how she was less productive. And I've noticed there's been a shift with my behaviours as well, that although I'm doing what needs to happen, there are some things that I've been dragging my feet with, and I've been curious as to why. And it is that impact that it's having on our emotions, on our thinking, and we have all been affected in different ways. And unfortunately, anything that was a pre-existing condition, for example, you may have struggled, or you might know people who have struggled with anxiety, depression, and mental health. These areas are being exacerbated by isolation and disconnection and the economic downturn and these other contributing factors. So much like everything else at this point, we don't know how that's going to look, but many mental health professionals are in complete agreement that in some instances it is going to exacerbate areas such as suicides, domestic violence, and we don't know is the short of it what the long-term ramifications will be. Now, I know that was a whole lot of doom and gloom there, so I'm going to move into, if this is the case, if this is what we're living in right now, all of this uncertainty and fear and anxiety, why is this? And I'm going to take a moment here with my sleeping, relaxed lion to talk about what happens with the body and the brain. So back in our caveman period, let me start that sentence again. Your brain is the most complex organism on the planet. Everyone's brain is. And neuroscientists suggest that we have 75,000 thoughts per day, which is phenomenal. We would only be aware of a small percentage of those thoughts, but your brain's primary purpose is to keep you alive. So back in our caveman period, when we were running around in caves, we would have to remember if we walked too far in one direction, there was a lion that could wake up and eat us. If we walked too far in another direction, there was a cliff we could fall over and die. And so your brain is wired for remember the lion, remember the cliff, remember the lion, remember the cliff. And COVID, with all of those concerns and worries and anxieties that I was just touched on in the last slide, is our modern day equivalent of lions and cliffs. And so what happens when your brain deems something as a threat? Threat to personal safety, threat to your economic security, which is your safety, your stress response is activated. And we can feel this depending on how heightened our stress response is. You might feel a few degrees warmer. The hair on your skin stands on end. your senses are heightened, your heart rate speeds up, the human body shuts down systems that are not important. For example, you will stop digesting food, women will stop ovulating as it prepares to fight the lion or run really fast in the other direction. Now, very useful for keeping us alive back in the day, probably not so useful now when we're watching a media report on COVID, but the same thing happens. And so have a think about during the course of a day, how many times your stress response is activated. And it might be a case of asking yourself that question. Let's say you've watched something or you've read something on social media that you found alarming and you feel stressed. Ask yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, where's my stress right now? So am I at a 1 for I'm still okay, I'm relaxed, or 5 being quite activated? If your stress, start that sentence again. If your stress response is being activated in short, sharp bursts occasionally, this is not harmful for the body. If it's this steady drip, drip, drip of stress, it can be very damaging. You may have heard the expression stress kills. They're referring to stress cortisol, which is a stress hormone that puts a great deal of pressure on the cardiovascular system. And in many developed nations, heart disease is the #1 burden of disease. It's contributed to obesity, and stress always gets a mention there as well. And this is part of that impact is stress cortisol levels in the body. So that's what's happening, and that is the why. That you will also remember the negative and remember the threats far more likely than you are to remember, let's say, for example, what have you done well this week? We'll hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to that when we talk strategies. This change grid is from a psychologist by the name of Kubler-Ross, and it was originally written for stages of grief. In terms of the death of a loved one, it's been used for divorce, but we also use this in organizational change because humans have a relatively predictable way of moving through change. However, that doesn't mean that we spend 5 minutes in shock and 1 month in the emotional center. We can swing back and forth on this pendulum here. For those of you that have lost someone you love, have a think about that first initial reaction. Someone will tell you that that person may have died, and our brain is incredible because it might have just responded with, well, no, that's not true. And that denial might only last a few seconds before logic starts to be processed in the brain. However, some people can stay in denial. And there's been multiple media reports from particular countries, including my own, coming from Australia, about Australians being quite apathetic and not honouring what the restrictions are around social distancing. And sometimes, especially with the younger generation, that might be an element of denial or shock where they can't simply grasp what this pandemic and the impact, the potential impact of that is. And so they are still in denial. What happens with this emotional quadrant is when we start to negotiate with self, we might feel really angry. There might be a level of sadness, but it's through those emotions that we begin to transition. When we move into the exploration and the hope of what things might look like, it's a key stage of change. Sometimes it begins with a bit of acceptance and then asking yourself these questions. So what can I get out of this time? What is the best way to manage my time during this pandemic? What kinds of goals do I have for myself during this time? We start to explore what this might look like in a healthy way. We're not quite in the commitment stage, but we can be moving towards the opportunity. I say that we're not in the commitment stage just because for many of us, we're still treading water, right? So we're in the middle of a global critical incident. I swear I'm going to move to some positive stuff soon. The title of this session is Building Resilience. Beginning with some doom and gloom. So what we need to be doing in terms of that first stage of acceptance is those accepting mixed feelings. And there have been times when I have engaged with the media, for example, and then felt quite anxious. And there have been times where I've been quite worried about family members that are in a more high-risk category, the economy, and I have these concerns. They lead to feelings which involves going up and down on this. It's like a seesaw of emotions. So we normalize that and we understand that this is part of the process. And if you're trying to support a family member that you think is not responding well, if there's no, I would argue at this point in time, there's no well about it. Everyone is going to be different. And that's largely based on your experiences, your lens, your background, and how badly you have been affected by this as well, because there's a range of impacts. What we need to be looking at is, in my life, what do I have control over today? And essentially, that starts and finishes with you. Welcome to the locus of control. So I've got so much to say on this slide. That's why I had to pause. Think, then speak. Otherwise, it'll be la for about 10 minutes. So let's see if I can be more succinct. If I was to ask you, what do you have control over today? Have a think about all of the little decisions that you make, from what you have for breakfast, or even if you have breakfast at all, from who you reach out to have a conversation with, how you structure your day, what takes your focus, all of those little decisions that you have throughout the course of the day. This is what you have control over. Your circle of influence is around your family, colleagues, anyone that you have contact with. If you ring and support a family member, or if you are short and snappy to your partner and they walk away feeling quite deflated, or your family member feels uplifted as a result of your influence. So that secondary circle there is all around your personal relationships and how you influence potentially another human being. But pretty much everything else in life, including COVID, falls into this. Sometimes it's a concern, but it is in the absolute zero control category. And much of what causes us worry is in that external circle. Because if we can change it, we often do. If it's something small, like, for example, I don't like where that couch is, I'm going to move it to the other side, and then it's no longer a stress of mine because I'm looking at a piece of furniture in the wrong place. That's a very simplistic example, but anything that is in our control, we can just action. But all of the concerns that we have are very, very frequently not in our control, zero control. And that is what causes us anxiety. So how can we take control? Being informed, and this will differ for all of you. And I'd like you to ask the question around media, social media, news reports, talking to a family member about COVID for an hour, all of these times that, or how long and how much time you spend linked in with the doom and gloom and the COVID. So if you feel that you need to stay across that, if you're feeling anxious and worried, I would limit the amount of time that you do this. And that will differ with all of you as to how much is too much, but ask yourself that question. We understand from September 11th that the whole world was affected, but a lot of Americans ended up with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a direct result of the media constantly replaying the events, which means people weren't detaching and disengaging with the source of anxiety, and it was just ongoing for years. So just be aware that, once again, threat response, how frequently your body is being activated as a result of what you might be staying informed with. So what I like to consider is for every action, there's a reaction. I love that expression. So if I have linked into a news report and then I'm feeling anxious, what do I do directly after that to take control back and do something positive? And I'm going to come to that in just a moment. So we can participate and contribute our ideas in terms of positive ways that we can utilize our time. So bring your family in and think about, what are our goals for this time? What would I like to do and achieve during these times? And keeping your goals short and realistic, and having these short-term goals, having these long-term goals. What are some of those opportunities for you? And definitely in terms of looking after yourself, what you can do. So we're going to talk now about worrying and a direct start to move into some of those strategies around how can we participate and contribute and do all of these, amazing sounding things. What does that even look like? First of all, your brain rewards you for worrying, which is kind of counterintuitive, one would assume. If you, as I mentioned, all of those concerns you have about that fall outside of your control, when you worry, your brain gives you a small amount of dopamine, which is our reward center. It's a feel-good neurochemical that the brain gives you for worrying, because at least you're doing something about it. Even if you can't find an answer, the brain is, okay, well, at least we're planning for that. And then it will keep triggering that threat response. So you plan and plan, and you make sure that you don't find that metaphorical lion somewhere. So it's helpful for our survival, yet give your brain something to do with that. Anything that you can write down is extremely helpful. And it's not just about being clear as to your goals, it's in the act of writing it down, because the brain really appreciates visuals. It's often how we learn, and also how we recall information. If I was to ask you to recall a conversation that you had with a colleague several months ago, your brain will recall that in images. Where were you standing? What was the conversation? What was the tone of the conversation? Meaning, were they stressed? Were they happy? Was it fun? And that we read from someone's facial expressions and body language and overall tone. But the main cue of recalling information is in the visual. So when you are stressed, it actually impacts the brain's ability to retain information. So writing things down is helpful, one, because you're more likely to remember, but two, the brain loves a visual. So you can write things on Post-it notes. You can have positive affirmations stuck on your bathroom mirror that you like. You can develop your own screensaver of somewhere that you'd like to visit when all of this is over. There's lots of ways of creating various visuals around you that are helpful for the brain and create some positivity. Goal setting. So the research around goal setting is people who write down their goals are not only more likely to achieve them, but happier. And it's a balance at this point around being gentle with yourself during this time, and not then smashing yourself over the head if you don't do an hour's worth of exercise every day. So it's good to have goals, but it is a challenge. Being gentle with yourself, being realistic with your goals, but having some short-term goals as well is really helpful. So I want to talk about pride and gratitude in a bit more detail. Neuroscientists suggest that these are the two strongest emotions for rewiring the brain for positivity. So with your list writing, start writing a gratitude list. For example, 3 to 5 things every day about what you're grateful for, and it cannot be the same thing twice. And the reason for that is, if I was to ask you today, what are you grateful for? Many of you will think, well, my family, my health, that's great. They can be on the list, but only once, because it's in the reaching, your brain reaching for what you're grateful for is strengthening neuronal pathways across your brain for positive thinking. And that's what we want to tap into. Another alternative is the gratitude alphabet list. Starting with the letter A, what are you grateful for today? Starting with the letter B, what are you grateful for? So on and so forth. You get the idea. Depending on the age of your kids, you can do this with your family around the dinner table every night. You can do this over a Zoom meeting with your friends or your colleagues. And it's just a nice way of not discrediting all those news reports or putting your head in the sand and refusing to acknowledge. It's about balancing what we have in our life. And this also leads me into pride and my earlier statement around what have you done well this week. So if your brain is hugely focused on lions and cliffs, it disregards the positive. It disqualifies the positive. So gratitude helps with that, but also writing another list of everything that you've done well. So instead of focusing on all the times you didn't exercise, focus on the time that you did do some yoga, that you reached out to a family member and helped them, that you rearranged your kitchen drawers and everything is nice and tidy, whatever it might be, because your brain will have forgotten all of those things because none of them are lions. So writing down that list, and that will also help look at or tap into pride. So pride and gratitude are those two really strong emotions. It's also good at this time to try to build pride and gratitude in other people. So if your partner cooks you a lovely meal, turn the volume up on that. If one of your kids is demonstrating some very good behavior, just positively reward that good behavior as much as possible. So we are developing pride in other people as well. And as the expression goes, kind words cost nothing. And in the current set of circumstances, I think it's very important that we are kind to people, even though we could be feeling very stressed, which will make us more likely to be snappy and reactive with the people that we love the most in this world. So trying to think about how can I incorporate pride and gratitude, not only with myself, but with others. Reframe. I love a bit of reframe. So what has your brain been telling you about this current circumstances? And this is also another area that we do have control over. When I first started investigating COVID and got on my researcher cap and started looking at what I could find out about this, I am not going to tell you that I felt particularly calm after spending several hours doing this. I felt quite anxious, and I thought I need to reframe this because a lot of this is in the unknown. So how do you go about challenging some of your negative dialogue? And this is a snapshot of mine, this is going to be a disaster of epidemic proportions. So I would suggest that many of you are thinking, well, that's exactly what this is. Yes, it is. But if I stay in that, if my thinking throughout the course of the day is, this is going to be a disaster, as a global community, we will never cope with this. What is the long-term ramifications of? Finish that sentence. So my brain is spending all of this time catastrophizing, frequently years ahead of where my feet are in this present moment, because a lot of this hasn't happened yet. Some things have, definitely. Lockdown has been really challenging. So to add to that is to think about, right, how can I find the positives, look at what I'm grateful for, and start to reframe some of this. Goals help stay on track. Asking yourself those key questions. What do I want to get out of this time? So for example, I like learning, and because I'm already finishing my PhD, I don't want to study anything else. So Oxford University, for example, is running free 12-week short courses, which I think is fantastic. So for those of you who are thinking, I've could handle a short course. Who doesn't want to go to, no, sorry, not Oxford, Harvard University in the States. So you can come out with a Harvard University certificate at the end of 12 weeks, totally free. So Google that if you would like to learn a new skill. And I think this is really a good way of looking at it. So for those of you who enjoy nature, for example, can you do some gardening? For those of you who like cooking, anything, baking, would you like to learn yoga, Tai Chi, meditation, and other kinds of activities that link the body to the brain in this present moment? So that can be a whole range of activities. Maybe it's a creative hobby that you already have, or maybe you haven't done any drawing or painting since you were a kid. So if we start to tap into those kinds of areas, it gives the brain also something to focus on and something that you can say, well, all right, I'm in lockdown now for another month. I'm going to have a 4-week goal on, I don't know, pick learning to, and finish that sentence for me. What would you like to learn? At the moment, I'm learning all things about YouTube channels and Facebook. Mauritius, you know that this was boosted in your area. This is completely new for me, and I learned that from YouTube. So these are the kinds of things that are helpful for us. It's something new for the brain to focus on. And then the second point here is, what coping strategies can I use? So if you are feeling overwhelmed, maybe gardening, you're thinking, I don't really care about that right now. So what can we do? What are these coping strategies? Learning, as I mentioned, is one of them, but that might be too much. One of the things that is helpful during our time, if we're working from home, is coming back to the neuroscience of LIS, the neuroscience of habit formation, and this is huge during stressful times. Given that COVID has permeated all areas of life and there's all of this change, it takes, according to neuroscientists, approximately 1 month to make or break a habit. So if you are treading water, feeling really uncomfortable and unable to put down routines and patterns, just writing it down and having a structure around how you spend your time is really helpful. You will struggle or fight with yourself frequently for about a month, and you'll notice this pattern of a month. So drug and alcohol treatment settings are often 1 month in length. You will notice exercise programs are also often 1 month in length, because it's based on the same principle of 1 month to make or break a habit. But habit formation doesn't come from doing something 2 to 3 times a week, especially if you don't love it. Like if exercise is new to you, it's easier to do it every day for a short period than to do it 2 to 3 times a week, unless you enjoy it or you're already in a habit for it. So I would be looking at that. What habits do I want to form? And because I've been getting quite busy during the day, I've been getting up really early in the morning to work on my thesis chapters. And I was saying to my academic supervisors not long ago, this is the neuroscience of thesis writing. Well, it's not really, it's the neuroscience of habit formation. And so for the first month, I'm not going to lie, my brain was going at 4 a.m. No, it's too early, but I managed. And after about a month of this, it was about 3.5 weeks, I was getting up early, I was sitting on the balcony and writing my thesis chapters, and I would do at least a few hours before my day started. And that's been really helpful for me. So have a think about, what habits do I want to be forming over the next 4 weeks, and then I'll be off and running in my new area. Anything to do with breathing and regulating the nervous system. So if you feel anxious, just by taking 12 deep breaths from the bottom of your lungs and visualizing something that does not promote anxiety, putting your hand at the basis of your lungs or the bottom of your lungs and just breathing deeply 12 times is enough to reoxygenate the blood. So that links into the woman in amongst the plants and the cat. Meditating. There's lots of different short courses you can be doing on YouTube and listening to sleep talk downs perhaps, and mindful moments. There's some great apps available such as Headspace. I've got a whole bunch of links for you at the end of this session. But do your homework, do your research. What can you listen to just come back to center and breathe? So the other thing as well is around the physical. And I've mentioned exercise multiple times because quite simply, it's good for you and it's good for our mental health. In some research studies, exercise is akin to antidepressants for the elderly with mild to moderate depression. So it's very evidence-based here. So any kind of exercise that you can be incorporating is excellent. Connection to others. As a resiliency researcher, it became very apparent to me. So for example, when I was living in Bangkok back in 2018, submerged in resiliency research from around the world, the one thing that came up again and again and again is, as humans, we are as resilient as we are socially connected. So investing in those relationships, because it's not just about having your family under the same roof in lockdown. It's around, what is the quality of my relationships with the people that I love the most in the world? My mum and I have been Zooming recently, and that's been great because normally I talk to her a lot anyway, but it's nice to see her. And so anytime you can visually see someone is very helpful for establishing and building those connections. And looking at your self-talk, what are you telling yourself? How can you gently challenge any kind of negative self-dialogue about you and about this circumstances? So I've given you a whole bunch of strategies and I hope that was helpful. And what I'd like you to consider after this session is, what will you start doing? Is there anything there that you think you might want to be not doing? And then also, what will you continue? Because some of you already will be connecting to others and exercising daily. And so what are those areas that you can continue to build upon during this time? So that brings me to the end of the session. I've just got some links here as well of some of my favorite resources. At-home exercise, totally free for all different levels and stages, is Fitness Blender. So if you haven't seen this, definitely check it out. Meditation, this is a British meditation vacation, but you can find anything you want. Jason Stevenson, depending on how relaxing you find the Aussie accent, I really like him. Jason Stevenson, you can check him out as well. There's your Harvard University free online short courses, lots of resiliency TED Talks. So if you've heard something on social media that you think, oh, now I'm feeling anxious, check out my favorite social worker and researcher, Brene Brown. Some of you will be familiar with her. So the Resiliency TED Talks are lots of different experts talking about resilience and different areas of resilience. So if you've liked this topic, here's a bit more information there. You'll also find these links on my Facebook page as well, I should mention, so you can easily cut and paste. There is a positive psychology workbook that I really like. It's very simple. Got some great little activities in there that you could perhaps do with your family members as well, and it's free to download. So please feel free to, yes, go and click on some links on my page as well and see what other resources are available to you. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending today's session, and I hope you got something really useful out of it. Take care of yourself and others. Until next time, bye for now.